Welcome, Paul, Sam, Jonny. Definitely looking forward to a bit of banter. Perhaps to kick us off, you can all give us a bit of an introduction into yourselves, what your area of interest stroke expertise is. And also then I'm keen to understand what was the first EV that you drove, how long ago was that, and how does it differ to what you currently now drive? So who wants to go first?
I'm happy to go first if nobody else nominates themselves.
Go on, Jonny.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jonny Berry, and I'm the chief barista at the EV Café, well, at least for the time being. My day job is working with Hitachi Capital Vehicle Solutions as head of decarbonisation. And good question, Catherine. My first EV was a Japanese edition of the Nissan Leaf, and it looked identical to the one above my head, but a lot bigger, actually, and with a motor and with a battery. And it would do no more than sort of 50 or 60 miles. But I did take on the challenge to drive from Eastbourne to Newcastle several years ago. And yes, a lot of charges, but I made it. And it was at a time when the network was actually free of charge. So that fitted well with me, where I've got very long pockets and short arms. But today, yeah, thanks, Paul. But today, I'm actually in something completely different. I'm in the Mercedes EQC, courtesy of Mercedes, as a demonstrator vehicle at the moment. And it does a considerable amount more miles. It does. There's a lot more out there in the charging network for me to plug into, albeit not really many that are on that are free. But yeah, that's the difference in what EV I drive now. And I reckon I'm coming close to about 200,000 miles on personal and business mileage in an electric vehicle. So it's come a long way. And hi, Gary Harrison. Nice to see you again too.
Succinct, Jonny. Well done.
Go on then, Paul. You go next.
Open my mouth and put my foot in. I am the acronym police for the EV Café, and I'm also the guy focused on commercial vehicles. Obviously, keeping both our audience and our contributors sort of aware of the need in the commercial vehicle sector. And I've been in the commercial vehicle sector for coming 18 years now, and that is when I drove my first electric van. And that was I didn't drive an electric car before I drove an electric van. So I drove a Mercedes-Benz Sprinter in 2004. It had about 30 or 40 miles range. It had a top speed of about 40 miles, and it had the payload of a bag of crisps or thereabouts, because the batteries were that heavy. I didn't have to charge it because we were just driving it around a circuit, as I'm not sure if it was even legal on the roads. But yeah, that was my first. But my first, so I've driven a variety of electric cars ever since, and vans, of course, driven all the vans or most of them. Even had a few minutes drive around the car park and the arrival van. There you go. It does actually move under its own steam, so that's good news.
One of them does.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sam.
Hi, everybody. My name's Sam Clarke. I am also part of the EV Café, obviously, and my role in the business of EV Café is looking after our finances. For some stupid reason, they decided that was a good idea for me. My day job is Chief Vehicle Officer at GridServe. And to answer Catherine's questions, I've been driving electric vehicles for 18 years. My first electric vehicle was an electric motorbike that I rode in China, where I first got into EVs back in 2001, 2002. And I've been running and riding and driving electric vehicles ever since. What was the range on my little motorbike in those days? About 12 miles, I think, with lead acid batteries, which has changed quite dramatically from the Model 3 and the i3 that I now drive. So, it's come a very, very long way. I also ran a last mile delivery company for 10 years in the city with a fully electric fleet. So reasonably experienced in the doing part of operating and running electric vehicles, and that's probably where most of my experience comes from.
Thank you all. And you reminded me that I probably should have introduced myself too. So I'm Catherine Bowen. I'm Senior Policy Advisor at the BVRLA. And my job today is to pose questions and topics for discussion to the EV Café. Please do put any questions in the Q&A. I see we've got one there already. We've also had quite a few come in beforehand, which was good to see as well. But perhaps to kick us off, topical subject of discussion and possibly debate, but we've seen quite a few posts around the fuel shortage, some arguably quite smug posts from EV drivers. I'd be keen to get all of your views on whether you think the whole fuel shortage has actually helped or hindered the uptake to EVs.
I can go first if you like.
Yeah, go Sam.
When you say people have put smug posts up, I wince a little bit at that, because that's not helpful. I think the reality is there is a benefit to the current issue, in the sense that we've seen the registration increase in appetite for EVs dramatically increase as a result of people getting frustrated with the crisis. But that doesn't mean that it's a smug position for EV drivers to be in, because it's not a laughing matter. There's a lot of people that are struggling to get where they need to be for very, very good reasons. So I personally, I only posted one thing about it in the entire time, and that was just a bit of a joviality around a certain BBC correspondent called Phil McCann, which I just couldn't resist. But ultimately, I think the reality is that it's not a laughing matter. People do need to get their fuel of choice at the moment, and for EV drivers to be smug about it is not helpful, really. We're all in this together. There's a transition, and some short-term gains like that just don't help. We need to just crack on in a more although EV Café is all about the banter and the messing about and having a laugh. This is a serious matter, and there's a serious transition we've got to do behind the scenes.
I think a post from Fiona Howarth, actually, I think it was in their Facebook group, Octopus Energy. She made me aware, certainly, of the opportunity to sign up for providing support and lifts for people that nurses, doctors, people that were in the sort of front line, almost in the same way that we did in the pandemic, kind of stepping up to support. And as Sam points out, banter's one thing, and I suppose there's that element of feeling positive as you drive around the traffic queue for the petrol station, and internally perhaps feeling a little bit made the right decision there. Then you do feel that, but is it helpful to kind of stick the fingers up out the window as you drive past? No, probably not. It's not a productive thing. And I think the EV Café has always stood for collaboration and community. And community, steps up in times of difficulty, doesn't it? And I think that is the key message that I think we'd want to leave collectively, is that we collaborate together, and it's about community and helping people, because then at least they'll get to experience the joy of driving an electric vehicle, or being in an electric vehicle, which is so much nicer, both as a car and as a commercial vehicle, than driving around in a diesel petrol counterpart.
I think, just to add to that, I think we've all seen the Leonardo DiCaprio meme, and I was quite quick to share that amongst my own social circle. They find it funny, but I saw it's erring on the side of smugness with just my own social bubble, and that's because they're experiencing something that I've been experiencing for the last several years. Turning up and charge points haven't been available, or I've had to do a little bit more planning than they have, and stuff like that. But on the back of that, the plus side is I've spoken to my friends' mothers, mother-in-laws, and various other people, not in that way.
What's going on?
But helping them actually understand, they because of all of this, they've now really considered EV. And they're coming to me because I've owned an EV and I've got experience with those vehicles, and I've had some fantastic conversations with them. And as a result, they've gone and bought mainly used Leafs. I think a little bit doesn't hurt, but it depends on your own social bubble. My friends can take that.
And it's really important, because I returned from Finland to pick up my car on Tuesday. And I booked charging as a service within that thing, and it failed completely. And when I realized that I was going to miss a meeting, I was going to be delayed. I was going to have to do this, that, and the other. From an electric point of view, I was really kind of, but everybody's experiencing that at the moment. But it is a small taste of sometimes how this transitional process of electric vehicle use and adoption is there, that it gives everybody a bit more of a level playing field. So I think it's good for people to have gone through this understanding, but also I think we as a community shouldn't be quick, because I'm sure they drive past us many times and laugh as we are battling or kicking a charging point of some description or other.
And then I see that there's a Q&A from Robert, who said the fuel situation will have made little difference, if any. What happens when France carry through on their threats to cut off the UK's electricity supply? So, and there's also a question from Toby, but I'll come back to that in just a minute. I mean, when Caroline Lowe was speaking this morning, the whole sort of equitability came up around not only owning a BEV, but also charging. And I know, Paul, you've mentioned before about sort of concerns around two-tier sort of charging. I was struck by some research I heard the other day around sort of mass BEV uptake, and the fact that a lot of people either see it as eco warriors or highly paid sort of sales execs that can afford to charge and have that driveway. How do we get beyond that sort of, how do we make it appeal to the mass market? And then going to Toby's comment as well, but do you think the EV sector is good at the soft sell? There are some very, very passionate advocates, but there is that fine line between coming across as a little bit arrogant. So maybe if you can just have a bit of a discussion around some of those points there.
Well, let me take that first element of it, which sort of thinks, one, is there enough electricity and all of that kind of stuff. I wish Graham Cooper was here; he would be able to answer that very effectively. But certainly from the National Grid's perspective, they've never sort of felt that there was any threat really to the UK in that. We've heard the timing thing, and all of those things will work out. Mass adoption and how we get there, I think we need to focus on the areas that are most important, because when you think that mass adoption at the moment is being driven by, as you correctly point out, the people that are making the most benefit out of benefit in kind, the reduction of the zero tax, pretty much. I mean, a matter of a couple of quid a year or a month. But the sectors that need to be decarbonized are those that are affected in the inner cities, it is our towns and cities, and it is the commercial vehicle sector that I would argue has been left behind a little bit. So, I think we need to really focus in on where the greatest benefit is, get those prices level, and kind of that whole soft sell around the TCO and fully understanding that whole life cycle, I think, is really important, particularly to the commercial vehicle sector, which will benefit not only by lower fuel costs, but by vastly reduced maintenance costs, much less downtime, the probability, and if initial evidence would suggest less accidents and so on, then I think those will be the things that will surface and help fleets change, assuming that we can get the vehicles, of course.
So what I'd add to that is I'm speaking with Graham actually on the Grand Designs panel later this afternoon. So I wish he was here with me, but I often channel some of his information. And one of the things he's always said about the energy issue is there's always going to be enough capacity. Indeed, if everyone drove an EV tomorrow, we would have had demands on the grid no higher than they were back in 2001, 2002. So it's, as Paul said, it's about a timing issue. We've got lots and lots of different ways of creating energy and planning for the future. Everyone's not going to have EVs overnight, so there's plenty of means and ways which we can plan for that going forward. So I don't think there's any scaremongering that is particularly useful in that regard. As far as getting people on this journey is concerned, to reference somebody else in the EV industry, Dan Caesar from Fully Charged, he wrote a blog recently about, I think he was using the analogy of onions and layers of people like pioneers, like arguably some of us here are. You've got your early mainstream, your late mainstream, and your laggards. an early adopter, after the pioneers, and we're at the early adopter sort of early mainstream sort of area at the moment, and there's an education piece or an awareness piece that we now need to do to make people more comfortable, and part of that is giving them the comfort that the charging infrastructure will work and will be useful. I parked at the NEC today in a car park with probably 2,000 cars and 2 charge posts, which were obviously full before I got here. So there's things like that we need to get people in more of a comfort zone of knowing they can go to places like this and be able to charge effectively. And that's an education piece we've all got to do. There's always these 2 phraseologies of charge anxiety and range anxiety. The range anxiety is diminishing because vehicles are going much further and there's loads more of them available than there used to be. Charge anxiety is the next nut to crack, which in my day job, like to grid serve and all of the other guys are trying to do, to try and give that comfort. And then when people have got just that little bit more comfort than they perhaps do today, then we'll tackle that early mainstream and we can really crack on. But those of us in the industry need to work really, really hard now to get people in their comfort zone of being ready to make this transition, and preferably ditch the hybrid on the way and just recognise that's not a fuel efficient way of moving around. So it served its purpose for a little while, but let's skip that and go straight to EV.
Yeah, I can just add a little bit more to that. You mentioned about the kind of pressure selling and other bits. People don't want to be in a pressured environment. They need to go to places where people are willing to part their knowledge, as Paul said, on TCO and what range will they actually get, how does the network actually work, what vehicle to choose, what's that vehicle capable of. And that's why they're, a little bit of enthusiasm helps, but that's why EV Café exists. There's lots of really, really good forums out there. There's lots of social media channels that can help people with their knowledge and understanding. You probably can tell I used to sell EVs, and crucially, there are significant roadblocks and principally spending a lot more time with the customer that someone that's not enthusiastic about EV isn't willing to commit to that kind of time. So it does help that little bit of enthusiasm.
I think, Jonny, you make a really good point, actually, because there was, I can't remember, I think it was a conversation with you, Sam, wasn't it, about a friend of yours that had gone into a Renault dealership and somebody had said, or I was talking to somebody, basically the salesman there said, look, Scotland's not ready, it was in Scotland, Scotland's not ready for electric vans, so don't bother. You just think, okay, now, whilst he, if he knew his customer and knew the scenario that he was working with, he might have been able to give a considered opinion. But I think the education process needs to go across at every level of the first tier, which is that sort of engagement between, the automotive sector and their customers. And we all have a responsibility to kind of raise the profile of truth, not, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, FUD. In the marketplace, and give people the opportunity to make a considered opinion. To Toby's point, that softer sell, to give them all the information so that they can make a true and value-related choice between an ICE, an internal combustion engine vehicle, and an EV, an electric vehicle.
And there's sorry, Jonny, go on.
I was only just going to say, I think it's really important to talk to somebody that has first-hand experience. Otherwise, you're not going to get that true to life knowledge. And yeah, that's the only bit I wanted to raise.
I can see there's loads and loads of questions coming in, so I'm going to start to tackle some of them. Amanda from the BVRLA has asked, what's the cafe's view on the changes to the charge point grant? Will it have an impact on take-up? Now, I'm not sure if that relates to the workplace or the home, but I know there are changes afoot with the home charging, where obviously they're moving away from the home charge grant and instead focusing on rental and sort of lease properties and things like that. So home, yeah, she does mean home. So who wants to take that one?
Well, I mean, for me, I'm really positive about it because I think it steers away from those that have already to those that potentially don't have already, which is, the terraced housing, the rental accommodation, housing association, that type of stuff where, we've got to make this available to all. And I mean, which is slightly altruistic in the sense that not everybody goes out and buys a new vehicle. So, we've got to think about the used market as well. So for the people that are going out there or driving a van home at night and having to park it by the street, I would like to see more street furniture. I would like to see more accessible charging points, more charging hubs, where people can take vehicles, charge them in their local area as they would their car, have it parked securely, and come back to it, charged in the morning in the same way that somebody with a house and a drive would be able to. So for me, it's a positive move.
Jonny, Sam, anything to add?
I think it's a bit of a positive move. I think the off-street, if you have off-street parking, you have a car, then you're very fortunate anyway. So having that additional £350, and I think maybe that it might just change the way people purchase their charge points at home. They might take on more of a subscription option, and then just build it into their TCO costings. Maybe 30.
TCO being total cost of ownership, Jonny.
Thanks, Paul. But yeah, I think the focus needs to be more on the attention of those that don't have the off-street parking, that aren't fortunate to be in that situation, and getting access to a better rate than they would potentially get on the network.
There was also a question that came in beforehand that was again around people in flats having a hard time accessing charging. Will it ever be possible to have enough EV charge points for all tenants in flats, do you think?
I think the key point there is that there's a lot of people in flats. Obviously, a lot of people don't have the off-street parking, but how many of those actually own a vehicle? And then I think personally, that the community charging opportunities that are out there could be a solution. And I'm taking this based on my own example. I don't use my charge point very often now that I have a 200-mile range and I don't have to do those long commutes. So my charge point in my driveway is free most of the time. And I live on a new build estate where there's not a lot of parking. So I've actually given my neighbour an opportunity to go and get an EV based on the fact that they can use my vehicle for the next 3 years. I have no plans of moving, using my charge point for 3 years. And they're seriously considering it. So, but it's that connection, and it's the chicken and egg first as well, But there's not enough out there that can offer that, and making sure they're connecting to each other.
Yeah, all I would add on the apartment blocks and the flats, etc., is there's always going to be a solution, and because there's so much smartness, intelligence being applied to both vehicles and chargers now, and indeed metering, that will be solutions, and there already are solutions out there where perhaps centrally on these dwellings there needs to be a centralized solution which enables separate metering back in the underground car park or wherever the car parking is, because obviously it's very highly likely that the car parking is nowhere near the source of power for that building, and certainly nowhere near the individual apartment owners meter. So there just needs to be clever ways of working out how to do that, and probably the challenge is the whole chicken and egg of you might have one electric vehicle amongst 20-30 car park spaces, and the other ones will be, but not yet. So the first person can't bear all the cost for the subsequent people thereafter. So there has to be a bit of a balance to try and get that right. And the only other thing I would say, akin to Jonny's point, is I'm privileged enough to have two EVs and a driveway that can park both of them, and I can charge them at home. But like Jonny, I don't actually worry too much anymore about whether it's fully charged when I leave. Whereas in the olden days, my life depended on leaving with 100%. Whereas now I'm far more relaxed, because I know that, I would rather leave it at 60, 70, 80% charge, because it's better for the batteries. And I know that I'll be fine, and I'll be able to charge on the main routes. And yes, I might be a bit biased because I work for GridServe and I have a Tesla, but it's getting better all the time. And my concern about leaving and having, my concern about having off-street parking is less now. Because the vehicles are going so much further, and there's so much more opportunity to charge on the go. And we've got to just keep getting better at that. Everybody needs to keep getting better at giving that comfort that people can do that as and when they wish, irrespective of whether they have a driveway or not.
Yeah, thanks all.
Can I just add one little comment to Sam's there? I reckon I've plugged my car in at home about 5 times in the last year. And that's because I use the Tesco's when I do my shopping. Although I don't get much from it, I get a little bit more than I actually needed to drive there and back. And then when I go for my walks along the beach, I do have access to a rapid charger there. So less reliant, and the mileage and the opportunities out there. So yeah, I do just concur on Sam's comment.
Okay, so just tackling a couple of other questions that have come in. So Hugh's asked, on the charge point, is there any hope we'll get a point where the UK government actually has an accurate API for the location and status of the charging points in the country?
I don't think that's a government thing. I think that's probably a private thing, and the likes of ZapMap, etc., that are providing that information and doing a very good job, and have done for a many number of years. And a lot of us rely on some of the live feed and the live data on that platform. So I think it's not a government thing, that it's a private entity exercise that just needs to make sure that there's mechanisms both on the individual charge point operators networks to be able to provide that information, and then there's aggregated solutions like ZapMap that help with.
I suppose, Sam, it isn't the government's responsibility to surface that data, but I think maybe the government can help in legislating for that release of that data in order for the likes of ZapMap and others to be able to surface that data reliably, because there are some that don't play nicely, right? And we should hope for that. And I think in this transition, if this is truly a collaborative piece, which we all have to, people holding on to that competitive advantage and not innovating in a way that is helpful to the market, I think the government should step in and go, actually, no, sorry, you can't do it that way. That's not an acceptable way to do it. So, for me, no, it's not a government thing to do, but I think the government can help with surfacing that data.
I know as well, on the accessibility side, Motability's been doing some work with OZEV. In the same way, do you think it would be helpful to have something on van accessibility that's sort of open data?
Oh God, you've got him started now.
Paul's excited.
Here we go.
Listen, I mean, I have driven a number of vans into spaces that just don't fit, and that is across everything. I have not yet found one solid. Well, no, there is an exception. I will give GridServe credit. They have a space big enough for a lorry, and actually, there you could pull up a van at most of the forecourt spaces, so you could get a van there. But so many of them have no thought for the van community. And look, these are the guys that are going to be pulling into the motorways, getting that quick extra 20 miles charge. They're going to be in and around the inner cities where it's difficult enough to park anyway. And then you find a charge point and you've got no chance of getting a van in it. And it doesn't think about where the charge point might be located. Absolutely. If we're going to get this right, there needs to be a lot of thought. And I am encouraged. I have to say there is a couple of companies that we were speaking with last week that are very much focused on, EV charging hubs that are designed for vans that are thought. And I'll give you just one example of the issues that might arise. I was at a charge point area that was on a sort of, it was a highly used charge point area. And I was parked and I just started charging, and I was facing the charger, and all I heard was a loud horn behind me as a Tesla almost went into the side of a Sprinter that had just swung very wide and obviously slowly, not bothered to indicate. And there was a bit of twofold, and then the Sprinter turned across the main road to pull into the charge point because they had to take a very wide angle. And the Tesla almost went into the side of it. It was about 2 or 3 feet, and it was, the Tesla was off on its way. So first of all, there was an accident, and then the Tesla guy was, actually quite calm, fortunately, because the van driver was not. He was out the window with a sort of, a few choice words. And if the Tesla guy had responded in kind, there would have been a fight. It's as simple as that. There needs to be real thought around what happens for van charging. But equally, I fully endorse also the mobility side of it as well. Thinking about the cables, those cables are not light, for rapid charging and ultra rapid charging. We do need a lot of thought around that.
Yeah, sorry, Catherine. I just quickly second Paul's points there. I was kindly speaking with Sadiq Khan a few years ago when I ran my delivery company, and he asked me how much of the London infrastructure do I use, and I very politely, as best as I could, reply to him and say, "Well, Mayor, actually none of it, because I can't rely on it. It's too expensive, and I can't get my vans in your bays, so none of it is useful to me. I have to look after it. I have to look after my charging on my own depots. So." Arguably everything has been designed for cars, and that's understandable because that's they're the most prevalent electric vehicle on the road. But as Paul says, we now need to start really thinking hard about not just small vans, which the Kangoo vans aren't too bad because they're the size of a car. But anything bigger than that is now a problem, which needs to be remedied by all the charge point operators.
And trucks are on the way.
Yeah.
It's still tricky before we'll see them in the main network, but we will start seeing them for sure.
And I see that there's a couple more questions. And before I move away from infrastructure, just wanted to ask a couple of others. So one came in advance of the session that said, houses are retrofitted with 240 volt capability. Will it ever be capable or safe of handling 480 volts? Any views?
I'm going to just put my hand up and say I don't really understand the difference. I mean, I know that the voltage capability does drive up the ability for the vehicle to speed, to charge faster. And if by that they mean three-phase electricity, which is possible, I suppose. I mean, feel free to jump in and correct me if anybody thinks I'm wrong, but it could be three-phase. I mean, certain parts of Europe, I believe Germany has three-phase electricity as standard, and that will allow a higher rate of charging, 22 kilowatts and possibly above even, because I know that there's a calculation around voltage and amps, and then that results in the distribution of the power. So, I mean, I don't think it's going to massively change in the UK, is my view. I think we'll probably stay with 240 and 7 kilowatts. There's not really, I think, if it was just my view, I don't think there's a need to charge any faster than 7 kilowatts at home. Exactly. I think, that will satisfy most batteries overnight or in a decent sort of 10 or 12 hour period, even getting upwards of, 100 kilowatts. Nobody's ever parking with 0 or very little. So I think 7 kilowatts is adequate, and you can get that on a standard housing kind of supply.
Yeah. And then the final point I wanted to sort of draw on infrastructure, and it's something that came up in the chat earlier, was around the speed of charging and the sort of max capability that the vehicle will allow. And that's not always that obvious to people. So do you think that does need to be more transparent, and how do we make that happen? How do we get people to understand? I mean, there was reference this morning to ultra fast charging. I still think there's a lot of confusing around what's fast, what's ultra fast. How do we get over that confusion, and do we need more transparency on the sort of capability of the vehicle versus the charge point?
Okay, I can have a go at that one if that's all right. We get people every single day that say, I plugged into your 350 kilowatt charger and I don't understand why it didn't charge that fast. And that's because it can't, because the car cannot take the amount of power we can distribute yet. And vehicles, as they get better, will be able to. This whole ultra fast, rapid terminology, we've got away from all of that, and we just call it kilowatts because that's the level of power that's being distributed. And if it's a low kilowatt 7 at home, or 350 on one of our chargers, then there's a material understanding of the difference between those two numbers. One's much bigger and therefore can distribute more power more quickly. So personally, I think we should be phrasing our power based on kilowatts, because that's ultimately what it is. And then we can have across the broad range of different charging mechanisms. There's one unit of measurement which covers all of them, rather than trying to put definitions to it, which people that misrepresent. As far as the vehicles are concerned, I think that's a really, really important point, that every vehicle charges in a different way. So even a Tesla Model 3 can charge at 250 kilowatts, and an Audi e-tron can't get anywhere near that, but it can maintain a high level charge for much, much longer. So actually it kind of charges faster because it can retain higher levels of power for longer during the charging cycle. And even me saying it like that makes me think I'm not explaining it very well, and it's probably confusing. So with someone who have never seen an EV before, is never going to have a clue what I just said. So we've got to try and find ways of educating people on what a charging curve is, why it matters, why does the charge between 80 and 100% take longer than the first part of the session, and all of that education is going to be really, really important. Paul, you're chomping at the bit. Crack on.
No, well, I'll tell you what I'm chomping at the bit about, because, to your point there, Sam, we need to get it in words of 1 or 2 syllables. And as Einstein always said, get it to be, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you can't explain it. You don't know well enough. And I think I think what is helpful is for clear surfacing of the key data. How long will it take normally? And at what charger will you get that speed? And I think, what we say is, and Sam, we've talked about testing this many, many times, but, each manufacturer will say you can get in 35 minutes, 20 to 80% charge. Now, I'll be honest with you, I've never seen at any point me plugging in at around 20% and getting to 80% in the time suggested. So we need honest and clear transparency. And we also need, right from the beginning of the sales process for people that are, purchasing the vehicles, this is the fastest you can charge, and these are the places you can charge at. You need more than 50 kilowatts or something. I mean, I encountered a guy on a long journey up in the north of England, and he'd already charged twice, and they were stressed. And he said, "I've come to this 150 kilowatt charger because it will charge my car faster." And he had a particular brand that wasn't going to charge more than 50 kilowatts. And he said, "I don't know why it isn't working." I said, "That's because your car doesn't charge any faster than 50. And he was like, "What, really?" I said, "How long have you had it?" He said, 18 months. This is we need to surface the truth. And, I think it's unhelpful from the charge point side of things when we get adverts out that says, "We'll charge your car within 15 minutes. Sorry, whomever you are, whichever charge point company you are not going to charge a car in 15 minutes from 0 to 100%. It's just not going to happen. So let's have truth out there that if, then this will do. Qualified, evidenced truth. Almost like WLTP.
Yeah.
I
agree with you there, Paul. I remember several years ago that we were telling, some OEMs were telling their customers they were going to get this range according to NEDC, which we quickly realised that NEDC stood for not even distinctly close when it came to real world range. And then you started seeing some real world range calculators, which was really helpful. You put in your temperature outside. Obviously, it didn't measure driving styles, which we know accounts for a lot of loss in range and topography and stuff. But I think I've seen from a couple of OEMs where you put in your vehicle, your specific vehicle, your battery, the start of when you would charge and the target of where you charge. And that calculation would then give you the times for the different types of charge points, whether it's an AC, 722, 50, 120, 350, whatever, and it will give you a target time. And that, for me, has been really helpful. And I don't know if all OEMs are doing that, but I think that kind of tool is where it needs to come from the OEM.
Okay. OEM being original equipment manufacturer, i.e. the car manufacturers, yeah.
And there's a question that's come in from Gary Harrison that asks, what's the panel's thoughts on the suggestion from next year that home and work charge points will be switched off at peak times?
I think in the round, that's a very good idea. I think the reality is that the people that do have off-street parking that can charge through their dwell time or through the time in the evening when they're asleep, it makes perfect sense to, especially with a 7 kilowatt charger, nearly all cars will be able to charge in 5 or 6 hours. You very rarely turn up with nothing. So it makes perfect sense to me that we start to get the charging points at homes smarter, so that people can start their charges at 11, maybe even 10, 9 o'clock in the evening, when the peak demand has tapered away. It makes perfect sense to do that. It makes no difference to you as a consumer, because you're still going to wake up with a car fully charged, and it just means that the grid is under far, far, far less strain, and the local grid at that as well, not just the main grid, but the local grid.
Cool.
I was talking to our good friend Greg Kirby yesterday, who is a font of all kinds of knowledge. And he was telling me that WPD, Western Power Distribution, as a DNO, have a lot of charging data. And he said evidence is proving that people are not currently charging at peak times. And so I wonder if it needs to happen, because I think it sends out the wrong message that we can't cope. And I think that it also does not allow for individual business requirements. So if you just do a complete switch off of people charging at peak times, that is really unhelpful, because you might be a builder that has just returned from a job. You need, a couple of hours charge because you're going to go out and be on call later. I don't think it's helpful. What I think is helpful is that you drive behavior by the tiers and the tariffs that you have, and you again surface the information around, if you're an EV driver, these are the best times to charge your vehicle because it is significantly cheaper. And anybody with a brain and that wants to put their hand in the pocket every now and again will soon work out that actually, unless you charge at the right times, your pocket is going to be significantly emptier. And I think it's a better way of managing it through financial incentive to get people charging at the right time and get, again, that education process that charge at the right times and things. I don't think a blanket turn off at 5 o'clock till 7 o'clock is going to be remotely helpful.
I think there's a bit of a balance there, Paul, because it depends on what the uptake is in the going forward. I mean, the electric vehicle community as it stands today, I never charge my car unless it's between 12:30 and 4 o'clock in the morning, because that's when it's 5 pence a kilowatt hour. So it would be mad not to do it when it's cheaper. So I think the current community of EV drivers are incentivized by virtue of tariffs that encourage them to do it anyway. So there's other drivers that do it, as in other mechanisms to drive that behavioral change. But when we get to the sort of early adopter, early mainstream, when everyone's plugging in, I think we'll find that there's more of a strain in that particular area, and we might have to think about other ways of doing it. It's not just going to be solved by incentivizing people by virtue of their pence per kilowatt hour. So it may well be there's a balance in there. We'll have to wait and see.
And I'm chuckling at a question that's come in from Toby, because he's asking for a friend. On all your EV travels, have you seen much evidence of charge rage, i.e. people fighting over charge points or racing around service stations trying to get to that last charge point?
I've seen a few instances whereby people are quite frustrated, and this goes back to the charging curve issue, where people are getting their cars up to 100% on a public network. And it may well be that between 90% and 100% of that particular charge session takes half an hour, if not more, and people don't necessarily understand why it's taking so long, and also perhaps don't recognize the fact that somebody else could have another couple 100 miles, or at least 100 miles in their car that are waiting next. And I think there's a bit of frustration I've seen a few times when people are a little bit frustrated that people are maybe hogging things, when reality is on the public network. If you're on a DC charger, no one should really be there until 100%, unless there's an abundance of chargers. The etiquette should really be just be on your way at sort of 80-90%, so that somebody else has the opportunity to use them whilst they're not, whilst there aren't hundreds and hundreds of chargers available for everybody. So I've seen some frustrations there from time to time.
I think the bigger frustration for me is turning up to the thing and it doesn't blasted work. Then you want to kick it and jump up and down. That's where I experience more rage, and I must admit I do get kind of a bit stressed when that happens. So I think that's very likely to happen, because you kind of turn up at one, it doesn't work maybe, and I know they're getting a lot better, and that is definitely changing, and I think it happens less. But but then you kind of catapulted into this need to charge, and kind of it changes. But I don't know. I'd be disappointed to see people charging around. I think it can be an emotive subject.
I think I've seen the worst from an EV driver when they've turned up and they're being iced. And iced, before you get me, Paul, internal combustion engine. The petrol diesel car is on that charge bay, and they cannot get access to that charger because of that petrol diesel car that's using that space. And I have seen the worst of EV drivers. A cool, calm, collected guy would go up to the window and use some very, very choice, red-faced words. But yeah, they're the worst that I've seen. I mean, there's other frustrations as well, but I think that's a particular one for EV drivers.
And I think, Sam, you raise an interesting point around the sort of etiquette, and I know I'm subscribing to an EV, and in the sort of welcome video, it was part of the education was, it's good etiquette to just charge up to 80%. But also since then, I've also learned that it takes just as long to go from 80 to 100 as it does from 0 to 80. And I guess if more people knew that, then that might make them think differently. But whose responsibility is it to sort of to put that education out there?
Oh, I think it's got to be all of us, isn't it? I mean, I think as a charge point operator, if I put my GridServe hat on, then we definitely need to make people aware of the fact that is how things work. Similarly, the OEMs, the automotive manufacturers, before Paul
original equipment manufacturers.
Yeah, thank you. They also have a duty to educate and share that information, which a lot of them are not doing. They're not. A lot of the dealerships don't even let customers know there's a difference between AC and DC, or how you plug in. We've had customers saying, I don't understand why my ID3 won't charge as fast as it could on your network, only to find they didn't know where the secondary flap is for the DC port, which is an entirely different cable entirely. That happens so often. You think, how did you not know that? But then you don't know what you don't know, and people haven't told them. So I think chargement operators, the automotive car manufacturers, the EV Café, BVRLA, whoever it is, needs to continually share that information consistently and concisely, and then eventually by collective contribution, we'll do better to educate people, I think.
I think it's so important, Catherine, that there is a standard of measurement. We've done it for fuel economy for ages. We need now to sort of implement standards of communication, because some of it is bordering misleading. To say that a vehicle will charge from 0 to 100% in 15 minutes is just never going to happen on the current product lineup. So it may happen in the future. We may get different batteries that don't go off at the end and all those kinds of things. But it's absolutely about being transparent, and really the OEMs, original equipment manufacturers of both vehicles and charge points, are the primary people that should step up and educate at point of sale. And then you've got the distributors of said equipment. They must be honest. There is definitely different charge rates to do with voltage, to do with amperage in, and total available power, and load management, load balancing, and there's a myriad of things, and we are beholden to tell the truth and to be absolutely crystal clear, so that nobody is misled or has any false expectation, because it's unrealistic expectation that causes rage and disappointment and sadness.
Yeah.
Paul, you mentioned about standardizing the kind of calculations, but with fuel, we calculate our efficiency in miles per gallon. We buy petrol in litres, and we measure CO2 in kilometres. So, but it all comes back to...
We're clear on it all.
Sorry?
We're clear on it all. We all know what it all means.
Yeah. But again, it echoing what you both said, it all comes back to education. And the lady that was on a BP Pulse rapid charger for 9 hours was told that their 208 takes that long, and didn't specify what a DC charger does. And that same person didn't realise there was energy tariffs out there that would incentivise them to just plug it in at a different time or charge at a different time. So all of the conversation stems back to that education piece, which you both have already highlighted.
And when we look at sort of used BEVs as well, and how we create a healthy market for a lot of the used BEVs that are going to be coming onto the market in sort of 3-4 years' time, what do we need to do? What's going to give consumers that confidence that it's okay and it's safe and there's going to be longevity in the battery? What do we need to be doing? And again, who's responsible for doing that?
I've seen some really, really great examples of some used EV car dealerships that are not just only selling the vehicles, but they are really going out of their way to bring education, as we talked about earlier, no pressure sales. Some have fantastic content on social media channels, which sometimes I even go to, to look at reviews, and addresses the affordability challenge by, the used cars. So, yeah, and I think we'd probably see a bit more in that for the confidence piece for people going into a used vehicle, and bringing all that to life, and the state of how that battery's been looked after, what it looks like at the moment, what will it look like in the next 5 years. But as I say, there's some out there, some used car dealerships that are just doing phenomenally well in this space, and are well recognised now with lots of subscribers on their YouTube channels and stuff like that.
Yeah, I know that, on for anyone that has an iPhone in their pocket, you have a battery health setting, which allows you to see the status of the health of the battery. I think that Tesla have done a very good job over the last sort of decade, really, of demonstrating the battery health of their vehicles, and have been able to prove with data that the degradation of a battery is on average 1% per year on that vehicle. And now on that trajectory, that's phenomenally better than any ICE car longevity. And Nissan have always showcased their strength and robustness of their battery pack over a similar amount of time as well. So perhaps there's a little bit of a nudge that might be required, maybe legislatively or otherwise, to get some of the automotive manufacturers to showcase or share that information, to give people the comfort that just because it's 3 years old doesn't mean I'm going to have to spend 10 grand replacing the batteries on the 4th year. It's just not going to happen. But if people's perception, and perhaps mobile phones, as where I started this piece, perhaps mobile phones is part of the problem. People think, they'll be dead in a few years' time, so don't buy that. It's just not the case. There's so much more protection, so much more management of those cells and those batteries on an EV. So please don't compare things to mobile phones. It's something that will last a long time. And perhaps some of the comfort that's required needs to come back from the automotive manufacturers to say this is the detail that we've got to demonstrate that.
And I think manufacturers are already doing something in that they are giving an 8-year warranty on the battery. So it drops below a given percentage, be it 70, be it 80, whatever that percentage is, they will fix it and put it right. And that's really good news. So from a manufacturer point of view, they have stepped up on the one hand to say that if it drops below a certain standard, then we'll put it right. But I think to Sam's point, absolutely important to surface that information of the battery health. I mean, I suppose we've never done it with an ICE engine, an internal combustion engine. We've never done that. But they also degrade in performance over time. The brake horsepower, the fuel economy, all of those things diminish over time. So there should be an expectation that it will change a bit over time. But I think also, like Scotland, and I think Scotland lead on a lot of these things, but they're already, through the Energy Savings Trust in Scotland, supporting the purchase of used electric vehicles with grants and things like that. And I think maybe, just kind of mandating some sort of health check at the end of a lease, a 3 or 4 or 5 year period or whatever that is, and just using the fact that the manufacturers are able to kind of, put these back to a state of health. But there are also companies out there, kind of upgrading the batteries and doing all kinds of things, which is really good. So I think we're at early stages in the used market. We're just seeing that J curve in the new market. We'll see that in the used market. I think it's right for the Scottish government to do what they've done, but to the guy's points, we need to have visibility of the battery.
Okay. And a couple of questions that have just come in. We've got one from David Harden, who asks, coming back to smart charging, does the company have a view on the potential benefits of vehicle to grid when it's ready for both fleet, depot and home-based?
Okay, I can answer that. So once upon a time, back in my old world, I had the largest V2G charging network, which I think was 10 in my depot, in my delivery company. And that was fascinating and massively interesting and useful in the ability to be able to discharge energy out of my vans and support the building at certain times, and then take energy at other times to make sure that they were still fully charged before the next day. So there was only 10 V2G chargers out of 90 vehicles, electric vehicles. So it was still a pilot, but it was still getting great data and understanding the art of the possible in that regard. And I think it massively helps. On a consumer basis, I've got 100 kilowatt hours of energy on my driveway, which I can do nothing with other than use it to propel my car. If I could have it going the other way and back into the house when I needed it, then I would never, ever need to consume energy at anything other than 5 pence a kilowatt hour, because my vehicles could easily support the consumption of the house over time. So obviously that can't be done with a lot of vehicles at the moment. It's really only the CHAdeMO connectors and the Nissan and the NV200 or the Leaf and the V2G chargers are still quite expensive. But again, new technology and it's coming along all the time. So I think in a consumer market and in a commercial world, it definitely has a place. And I think it's really, really quite clever to be able to utilize that energy, which is stored, a lot of it, on 4 wheels. It doesn't have to be used just to power the motors. It can definitely be used to support the grid that it's plugged into at the same time.
And I see Scott Bradley has just asked, and I don't know what V2L and V2H is, so if someone can explain in their answer, but could V2L be used as V2H somehow?
I'm guessing it means vehicle to load and then vehicle to home. I would have thought a vehicle to load, I guess, is like, I think it's the Ionic, and the Transit is coming out of it, which is basically you can plug a standard 240 volt 3-pin plug into the back. So I suppose arguably you could plug an extension lead into one of a few vehicles that do have a plug. I think the Honda E has one as well. And then, run some of your ancillary, your home equipment off that. But I mean, that's designed in the van world to power tools. And so, the ability is there. Whether or not it could be used as a vehicle to home, I think would be a bit of a stretch.
Well, Sorry, Paul. Just to clarify my answer, which perhaps helps with David's point a little bit, is the vehicle to grid. I call it vehicle to grid. Actually, it wasn't. It was vehicle to building in my commercial depot. So the energy wasn't going back into the grid. It was just supporting quite a large warehouse with loading doors and huge amount of office and all the rest of it. So actually, it wasn't going back into the grid. It was just meaning that I didn't need to pull from the grid because I had my own power on this side of the meter, and there's no reason why in the home environment that can't be the same thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be exported and traded with arbitrage. It could just be there to support the home when required and stay all your side of the meter.
Yeah, and I think that's important, isn't it? To understand whether you're using the power to go back to the grid or go back to your building and your operation. Because from a commercial vehicle point of view, it's highly likely the depots are going to have to invest much higher amounts of money in the infrastructure that they're going to put in. When trucks start coming on stream, and we've all said, hydrogen for trucks. Well, there's quite a lot of electric trucks coming out. Renault have got a few. There's a few. The Iconic and DAF. There's some big stuff coming out with big old batteries, 200, 300 kilowatt hour batteries that are going to either have a lot of power in them or need a lot of power. And either way, they're going to be a great facility if we can get it both ways. So it could go back into the grid and you can be paid for that energy, or it could go into your operation, and it could mean that you don't have to spend money on that. But they should and could be a real benefit to any business that has to invest up front in order this kit. They might get their money back quicker.
And then I'm just going to change tack slightly. So, today in the Road to Zero report card is all about supply, demand and infrastructure. And we've spoken a lot about infrastructure. There was a question earlier or a comment from Gary Harrison around supply issues. Does the panel have a view on supply issues of EV over the next couple of years? One manufacturer said they could absorb their full year's production. We will end up fighting for limited supply. And I know we had a question in beforehand around the shortage of BEVs. The fact that this is looking set to continue certainly into next year, if not beyond. Should they perhaps be rationed or prioritised for certain customers? And if so, who should be prioritised?
Well, that's a difficult question, isn't it? I think with all sorts of different supply issues at the moment with fuel, there are certain people that should be getting the fuel that others are perhaps just squirreling away. How you manage that, or how you legislate or control it on what, whilst there are supply issues that hopefully they're short-termist for in many different industries. So I'm not quite sure how you would be able to do that on a reasonably short-term trajectory.
Well, I hate to be a broken record, but I'm obviously going to come back to the van sector and van on truck sector, because what we see is that one of the biggest challenges that we're trying to deal with, apart from the climate and the global climate emergency, we're trying to deal with local air quality issues. And local air quality issues can be mitigated with two things. One, the sort of ULEZ, which I think I'm just on the edge of the congestion zone now, but I'm certainly within the ULEZ, ultra low emission zone in London. And who are the people that are going into those areas? It means that actually we should supply electric vehicles to those people, because we're reducing the carbon emissions of the tailpipe specifically to improve air quality, which we are currently in court for. We have broken the law, and we're up against it. I don't know what the decision by the European courts are, whether they will be able to take us to court or fine us or do all of those kinds of things. But we're out of our depth, and we've got to address those problems about local air quality. And I think, that is where, if we're going to prioritise anything, that's where it should be, to drive air quality improvements, and nothing else really should matter, because benefit in kind definitely shouldn't matter, because it's just the wrong message. It's like the bankers story all over again, isn't it? Those that can get more.
Yeah,
sorry, go on, Jonny.
I was just going to say, I agree with you, actually. I think those that require a vehicle and operate or live in areas that exceed illegal pollution levels is important, because, yes, carbon dioxide equivalence is important to slow down the warming of our planet, but air quality is an immediate priority for our health and our children's health. Yeah. So, yeah, I agree with you.
And I commend Bath on that, because what Bath did was put in a clean air zone and then put in financial incentive and benefit for for people that would be accessing that area to change their vehicles. So it's a similar thing, not exactly the same, but I think, if we can do carrot and stick in both, hand in hand, works well for me.
But then a slight bugbear of mine, Paul, is that they give funding to people to purchase. And on the HGV side, my fear then is they're almost encouraging people to buy Euro 6 that may become obsolete as technology sort of catches up and there's more zero emissions. So I definitely like to see them offering rental and leasing options so that people can, they've got that agility to change as and when the tech comes available. So,
Catherine, you're absolutely right. And I actually wrote to them on that subject and said, look, guys, you kind of created a little bit of a closed shop here. So, it wasn't quite right, but it was well intended. But I think it didn't fully think about the wider context, as often is the case. Is the same with the 130% super allowance, which doesn't apply through leasing at the moment. I know that you guys are working hard to sort of get that addressed as well, which is the right thing to do.
And then one of the other big questions this morning was around demand and sort of incentives and how long they need to stay. So, we know that government are looking at either introducing more stringent CO2 regs or CO2 regs and a sales mandate. We've certainly made the point that you can't take away any sort of financial support at the same time. That's not going to be enough to stimulate that sort of demand. So any views in terms of how long we need those grants and incentives to stay, and at what point is the right point to sort of phase them out?
Well, I'm not sure what the timeline should be, and I don't think any of us do, but I think there should be a tapered approach to it, so that there should be a gradual reduction in the amount of incentives that there are and the grants that are there to meet the demand and trajectory. Although, having said that, we've got a 2030 ban on petrol and diesel, so that's one timeline that we all got to stick to. So there is an element of one marker in the sand in the future that we all know is coming. But it definitely needs to be a tapered approach, I think, because ripping, as you say, Catherine, ripping the sticker plaster off is not going to help.
It'd be nice to think it could be an intelligent tapered approach, because as obviously as we get the benefit of volume into the market in terms of the pricing. So we should see. I mean, when we saw the last changes of the grant, we did see some pricing action from the manufacturers, which actually I was really sad to see them actually move the prices just that little bit to just be then into the grant sector again. It proves that the margin was there in the first place to be able to do it, and it means that they were probably not being fully open and honest and transparent about the way that they could come to market, and using the fact that batteries were more expensive to milk the fact. And I think manufacturers need to be challenged about getting the price right for the vehicles, so that we can remove the grants, so that the market becomes a bit more level, a bit more truly competitive. But that it'd be nice to be intelligent and understanding the volume level and how that might impact the cost of batteries and equipment like that.
Okay, and just before I wrap up, I guess my final question to you all would be: what is one of the biggest lessons or the most important lesson that you've learned on your sort of EV journey that you would pass on? If you knew now what you knew back then, what would be the one thing that you would pass on to others?
Oh, I always hate this question because it was really hard. So I'm going to go first because then it's easier for me than harder on the other guys. But I think it comes back to doing research and understanding the thing that you're embarking upon. I think perhaps certainly in my world, I jumped in with a lot of things 2 feet and then worked it out as I went along, and probably suffered an awful lot of pain in the process. But a lot of us have already been down these roads literally for many, many years, and there's a lot of information out there to learn from. So I think probably do your research, understand what it is you're undertaking. What if it's specific to EV? There was a question about usable battery. What is the usable battery? Because it's obviously misleading in terms of the size of the battery. If you can't get access to the full size of the battery, what is your usable battery? What does that actually mean for your range? What is it going to be like in the dead of winter up hills when you're driving aggressively? Or whatever the metrics are, you just need to, I think I would probably do a little bit more research into exactly what the art of the possible is with my vehicle and my infrastructure, to know what the limitations were, or where I needed to work within, rather than just jumping in for 2 feet.
Okay, there's 2 things that I think. First of all, understand charging. Get your head around how that works. what's important, what's realistic, and then also realize that you don't need to charge. Every time you come to a charge point, you don't need to sit there for 45 minutes. You could sit there to get enough energy to get you to the bit that you're going to dwell longer. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, I think, because of a van, my focus on vans and commercial vehicles in particular, that actually it's time now to rethink, not just to change your vehicle. So it's not about putting a different vehicle on the road. It's about thinking about your operation. I heard a great presentation yesterday from fleet manager, and I'll credit him, Ian Hunt from Clarion. They've not got any EVs yet, but they are really thinking about every possible concept within their business. Can we give people an Oyster card? Because this is not about changing your method of transport. This is about decarbonisation, and it's about a bigger thing. It's about sustainability. It's not just about a change of vehicles. Everything from an Oyster card to a scooter to to a van to a truck, whatever. What do we need to do? So it's a blank sheet of paper, and build up from that blank sheet of paper. Don't look at what you've done before, because this is a new way of delivering the goods from a commercial vehicle perspective.
And Jonny, final word from you.
Yeah, so it's a really difficult question, but a good one. I think when I first got into EVs, I was just reading brochures, and that didn't do me any good. And so I would say that anybody that's looking to run a fleet of EVs or just have a personal EV, then try and speak to somebody that has that experience with that EV or operating EVs in their fleets. And I think that's the best bit of advice I can give, really.
Yeah, and Jonny, just to add to your own point, I think you said yesterday is try a vehicle, test these things out. Yeah, learn about them by doing, and do that in an environment that allows you to do it by doing a test drive, or come to an awareness day, whatever it is. Just learn that way as well. Just get in the vehicle and really get behind the wheel, literally, and then you'll understand it a lot better.
Absolutely spot on, Sam. I should have said that. I made the mistake of taking a vehicle that I never drove, and I regretted it, even though it was an electric vehicle. I won't give you the name. But immersing yourself in the product and experiencing it will absolutely help you make your final decisions far better than just doing, something simple without actually testing it, improving it, especially in the commercial world.
Sooner the better.
Yeah.
When the vehicles are available.
Join the cafe.
So I'd really like to thank Jonny, Sam, Paul. Thank you so much for joining us for today's session.